Okay. I'll just grab your attention. Oh, look at that. How are you going, everybody? Yeah, day 2, 11 a.m. So what we might do is get underway with our session here, which is titled Disrupting the I Focus for We. So we have 3 awesome presenters today. We kick off with Janelle Marietta. Janelle down the back. Come on up, Janelle. Janelle's going to present for us defining community and participation in community-based participatory research. So this is actually that I'm really interested in and close to my heart as well in terms of a really important area for scholars, practitioners for government. So Janelle, I will welcome you to the stage and I'll just help to adjust the microphone once you come up. There we go, Janelle. And just a little. Lots of claps.
Thank you. Good morning. I think it's morning still, right? I'm still figuring out the time zones here, but good morning, everyone, and great to see you all, and thank you for being here. I am thrilled to be in Australia for the first time. I'll explain my weird accent in a minute here in terms of my origins, but really great to be here and talking about this topic. I know I've heard lots about CBPR and PAR and co-creation and all of those really exciting fun terms throughout the last 2 days here, so I'm really excited to kind of dive in. So indulge me, I will talk, but I also really want to hear what you're up to and why this matters to you, so hopefully I can steal a little bit of time at the end instead of doing too much talking on my end. I'll try to get you in and pick your brains as well. So I'll get kind of going with that first and foremost as I drop my pen, excuse me. All right, so I am Canadian, as you might get. Thank you. Awesome. Fun fact, that is not a 51st state, but I am embarrassingly from Alberta, which is also not a country. So I'm just teasing if anyone's following the Canadian politics, but it's lovely to be here, and I'm excited to have a platform to make that statement as loud as I can. But more importantly, Lethbridge, Alberta, the university that I work with and do my PhD with, is on the traditional land of the Blackfoot people. And also important to note, the Treaty 7 territory lands as well. So that's where I'm coming from. I'll try to weave that in a little bit in terms of what that actually means for the research that I do, but we'll kind of get into that in a minute here. As a little bit alluded to, I am a PhD candidate at the University of Lethbridge. I am in my last year of research, so pressure's on, and here we go, right? But just getting into that. And so I am going to talk a little bit about the research that I'm doing for my PhD dissertation, but awkwardly not that much. This kind of came out of some of my work that I was doing with my comprehensive exam. It started to really piece in some of the work with community-based participatory research, which does weave into the work that I'm doing. So I am going to talk a little bit about my systematic literature review, boring, I know, that I brought in for the first stages of my research for my dissertation, but the topic itself with that SLR is not actually relevant to today's conversation. So I'm going to try my best to give you as much information as you need, but also not too much information because you're not going to care that much about that detail. So we'll go in there, but feel free. I'm really excited about immigration research, so if you do have questions about that or just want to talk about immigration research after this, please come find me because I would love to hear your insight. So we'll get in there. With a background, I am kind of wearing 2 hats in my life as a researcher. I am, as I said, a PhD candidate, so obviously doing work in the academic field and in that realm. But I'm also a practitioner in a lot of ways with some of the other roles that I've played. I have a long history in the not-for-profit sector, if anyone's familiar with the United Way, some 211 Alberta, in those realms. So certainly I've done a lot of work in the poverty reduction, in disability support as well, and in kind of that field in terms of housing and support. So all of that was really what inspired me to get into the CBPR work, really think about how we approach research, particularly today as we're talking about social marketing. That becomes a really important thing. I think is going to weave nicely into what we were talking about this morning, so I'm excited to kind of start picking all of your brains in a minute here as we get into it. But before we do anything, I'm really curious how many of you have actually been diving into participatory research in any capacity. So I'm going to get you all, if you can, or if you don't mind indulging me on this one, just to take a minute to do a quick scan, because I know quite a few of us are doing this work. If you're like, lady, I don't know what participatory research is, and I don't even know if I'm in the right room, don't panic. That's okay. You don't need to, and I'm going to give you some details. So I'll give a quick second here just for everyone to throw their answers. Awesome. All right. Excellent. Okay. All's good. Interesting. Okay, so we do actually have quite a bit of a mix here in terms of who has and who hasn't, which is really great. That gives me an excellent starting point in terms of, I'll give you a little bit of background on it, but also recognize that many of you are going to be far better experts in this realm, which is exactly where I'm going to turn this around on you and ask you some questions later too. All right, so as I said, my dissertation research is very heavily focused on immigration settlement, particularly in the Canadian context. So as I start picking on some of the research methodology that we're using, don't worry if you're in Australia, I'm not picking on you, you're doing great work. I'm going to pick on my Canadian cohort specifically on what we're doing over there in terms of why CBPR matters and maybe why we're not actually utilizing it as much as we should be. Okay, so again, for me, immigration settlement is a really important issue. It's a global issue. I know we're all facing lots of conversation around what settlement's going to look like, how things are changing at that policy level for government. All of these things are playing into factors. Obviously, geopolitical components as well are having a huge influence on what's happening there. So I'm doing a lot of work in focusing on how to bridge some of those supports with our newcomers in Canada to the not-for-profit sector, to the public sector, those types of things. So again, becomes a really transdisciplinary conversation, a lot of intersectionality within those conversations as well. So that's why CBPR became a really important thing to me. Moving forward for social marketing, I'm sure as you're reading the journals and seeing lots of really great research coming out of this field, CBPR, community-based participatory research rather, has become a really important conversation, and it's certainly getting utilized heavily, or more heavily, than we might have seen 5-10 years ago. So this is certainly, I think, timely in terms of thinking about what this methodology actually means for our field, what we're trying to accomplish, and more importantly, why it matters. Where are the outcomes to say that this is actually the direction that our field should be going? So that got me thinking, and that's kind of where this whole project started to move forward. So first and foremost, what is CBPR? Because I know a couple of us are saying, whoa, I have no background in this, give me some detail, and that's great. Community-based participatory research is essentially the methodology thinking about collaboration within a research approach. It really looks at flipping research on its head, thinking about how are we doing research with community rather than on or for community, which becomes incredibly important in this discussion. This is also a method that's going to challenge some of that traditional researcher-participant hierarchy, right? So again, looking at how do we build more collaborative approaches to research that we're doing, not just from the design phase, but all the way through, right? So we're talking about getting insight at every stage of our research design from community so that we're making good choices. Again, it goes back to the concepts of, as researchers, we think maybe we have ideas that are the problem in community, but how are we able to actually address issues that matter to community if we're not talking to community about those issues and actually helping us identify what is priority at that time. So it kind of moves us away from that drive-by research. We come in, we throw a solution at people, and then we say, we did it, okay, we're done. This is really important in terms of that co-creation. So I'll kind of dive into that a little bit more as we get into it, but again, that's a general principle about that. I want to take us back one more step just to talk about how CBPR plays into the landscape of methodology. Many of you are probably familiar with PAR, or participatory action research. And CBPR arguably, and again this is arguably because we're still really figuring out the parameters of all of this type of research and what that actually means, and that's what I'll get into today. But again, CBPR and participatory research, PAR, tend to fall under the similar umbrellas, okay? So I would argue, personally, and someone can certainly argue back at me once we get into the question and answer period, but I believe that CBPR falls within that PAR umbrella, okay? So we're going to kind of get into that. So what does that actually mean? We've talked a lot, and I've heard a lot of really great discussion in the last 2 days about engaging community, about getting more practical research out into our communities. A lot of us as academics trying to figure out how to bridge those gaps, how to build those relationships. Certainly that becomes a really important question. And I think we're at a stage now, going back to the whole concepts of the paradigm shift yesterday in a lot of the discussions, I think we're there. I think we're at that stage now in social marketing where we need to start thinking how we're going to bridge those connections with community in meaningful ways, but also in sustainable ways. And I think that's really the critical part of this conversation today, that I'll show you how we kind of teased out some CBPR data from the immigration settlement research that we were doing in Canada that starts to actually give us some solidified evidence that there might actually be something to using CBPR. There might actually be really obvious rationale as to how CBPR and PAR research is actually better, arguably, but I think better than any other methodology, okay? So the first question here I'll get into is just how do we define community first and foremost, right? And this has been, I think, a big question for lots of us doing research with community and talking about co-creation. What does that actually mean? When have we hit the check boxes of, okay, I think we've included all the voices that we need to include? What does that actually entail? And I hate to tell you this. I'm sorry to bring this information forward. I've been thinking about this an awful lot in the last 3 years. I'm doing a lot of work, and there is actually probably no formula for that. There's no one size fits all when it comes to engaging community and making sure that you have the right voices at the table. This is, again, where humans are going to far surpass AI in the fact that you have to use critical thinking in this space to understand who needs to be there and are you actually getting the right voices at the table. So sorry to say it, if you're very quant and you want a lovely checkbox that says these are the voices that need to be there, you're not going to get it. There's no categories. You need to really think it through. But what I can suggest, or what I can bring forward to this conversation, is a little bit of what I'm looking at with these 3 pillars of community here. Okay, and we break it down into 3 sections, looking at researchers as community, and I'll talk about that in a second. The second being our anchor institutions within our communities, okay? And then the third being shared experiential knowledge. And one might ask, well, are those all siloed, or are there overlaps? What's happening here? And of course, we know as researchers, we all bring lots of experience. We all bring lots of perspective. We all bring lots of really great lived experience and perspective to those conversations. So I do argue that researchers do need to be part of their community in order to do research in a way that is true to the values of PAR and CBPR research, okay? And that becomes really important in this conversation. The other piece, of course, is recognizing that you're covering those 3 bases with your anchor institutions. Again, I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense for us to try to prescribe for every project what those anchor institutions need to be. But as researchers, we know who has a voice at those conversations and who needs to be involved there. So I'm gonna, again, we'll go back to this in a second, but I'm gonna keep kind of going in terms of where this project goes, and then we can scale it back in. So some of the challenges of implementation with PAR or participatory research within the social marketing field, and there's plenty of them, is first and foremost the inconsistency in our definitions of what community and participation actually look like. What does that mean? How are we applying this methodology in a way that is true to its values? We've seen a lot of criticism of researchers calling their work PAR or CBPR, but perhaps and arguably it's not actually. Okay, so again, I think as a whole field, we're still, and I'm not just picking on social marketing, this goes across all sectors, but we are tackling our engagement with community inconsistently, and we are certainly engaging participants at different levels and at different stages within the research. So I'm call to action here, I think, is it's really important as researchers and as community participants in that research to have these conversations and say, what is, to our standard, adequate engagement from community? And so again, going back to that first claim, I am of the belief that in order to actually have CBPR research occurring, we need to have community engagement at every level of the research. And I think that is absolutely critical. Okay, so that essentially brings us to the question of, well, what does that mean? What does that entail? How do we get there? So research with rather than on or for, looking at co-created, co-designed research, what does that actually mean for social marketers, right? How do we move forward? How do we actually create some kind of change? This conversation, I think, brings us to dissemination of findings, and I think it brings us back to the conversation of sustainability of our research. How many of us feel, we go through a whole lot of work creating social marketing campaigns, getting community buy-in, implementing those things. We have a tight timeline, very often due to funding or funding restrictions or limitations around how long we can run these programs. But then where does that live? Where does that actually go? What does that mean for community, right? And I think Sue had done a perfect job of bringing up that conversation around how do we sustain this and how do we buffer our work in a way that we can continue to challenge those conversations as policy changes shift, as things are happening in the community. So again, my call here is looking at research findings, moving us more from a co-design and leaving it at that in terms of the implementation, but actually pulling all the way to a co-stewardship of that work. Where is the work being disseminated? Who is doing that dissemination, and where is it actually living? And that's what brought us to the conversation around authorship. And authorship in CBPR, what does that actually look like? And I'm going to go really fast in this one, but bring it into the conversation. So arguably, authorship could be a really good indicator of transdisciplinary research, which is an umbrella of CBPR and PAR. So we pulled together from the systematic literature review, we had gone through and actually grabbed 283 articles related to immigration settlement. This is kind of the boring part, related to Canadian settlement. But in that work, we actually went and coded for all of the studies that included CBPR. So we had that piece. And then we went a step further and actually looked at which of those articles had non-academic authorship on that list, okay? And that was a really important piece, and this is where I'm going to kind of pull this in. So we're probably all thinking, oh my goodness, I don't know if I've ever actually co-authored with community, and I will yell at all of us right now for that, but I'll tell you why it's important in a minute here. We pulled that data, okay? So we looked at the information that we were coding for immigration settlement. It just happened to be we were looking for the number of barriers that people were identifying in those conversations in the study that gave us better insight into immigration settlement. That's by and by here. What we were looking at is actually do CBPR research articles do a better job of identifying those barriers? Then we looked at do the transdisciplinary or the articles that that have incorporated non-academic authorship in the author's list, do those two categories of research, or those two categories of articles rather, do they actually bring out better outcomes in terms of the data, okay? So we did a 2x2 if you want to get boring with quant, but we did a 2x2 model, did a t-test. We looked at articles that had transdisciplinary research and and then we looked at the number of barriers they got. We got the averages for both, ran it for both the transdisciplinary, so like the non-academic authorship, as well as the articles that claim to be CBPR. Pulled them out, compared them to all of those articles that were not either of those two categories, and actually got significant findings that those two categories are actually pulling out more barriers or identifying more barriers than those studies that don't incorporate transdisciplinary or CBPR research. Geek out with me for a minute. I was like, whoa, that's a really big thing. That's actually really important to know. This could be alluding to the fact that, you know what, CBPR and transdisciplinary research is actually producing better data. That's huge, that's a big deal. So bringing that in, we brought that conversation together. It is still early stages, so we're certainly still wrapping up in terms of the dissertation work that's going to pull this conversation in. But I thought it was necessary to bring it to this the conference, have a conversation. I'm more interested in opening it up to what your experiences have been with that. Have you been seeing similar? Has anyone seen other researchers that are also kind of trying to gauge this information? Because we haven't found it yet, but I would love to pick your brains if you've seen any. And then also kind of lightly offer a suggestion. I think we have a lot of SLRs to do in the near future to pull this not just into the Canadian immigration settlement perspective, but actually to start looking at, are we seeing the same significance in other areas of research that could suggest that this CBPR and transdisciplinary authorship approach to assessing our research methodology actually has some merits. So I think we've got a lot of work to do. So if anyone's bored in the next 3 to 4 months and wants to do an SLR and be a second coder on a project with probably no funds, I'll do my best there though. We'll have to talk. But again, I think this is really interesting. I think it's certainly bringing us to a stage where we can start to justify more empirically why CBPR matters, why non-academic authorship matters, and start to bring that conversation into the table. Perfect. No worries.
We will open the floor to questions. What a fascinating topic, and thanks for just actually stimulating this conversation. So who'd like to go first? We have a few minutes.
Thank you, and a fantastic presentation, and loved the energy you showed today, so thank you. My question to you is, when we talk about and discuss about CPBR, there lies the nexus of two major underlying ethical concerns. Number one is respect for community, and the second is fair allocation of limited public response. So could you please tell me what's your perspective, because you're looking at this research, and what do you think is the right way to take up these two issues?
Thank you. So again, my hearing's not great, but I think you're saying the challenge of actually engaging community in that way. Is that the second piece? Yeah. Yeah, and I think that brings us right back to that conversation around relationships, as well as researchers as community, right? I think we have a tendency to think we have an idea of what's going on in community, and we go for it. I'm arguing we're one person or one team. It's really important for us to be embedded in our communities and to build those relationships. Now, I recognize that slows our funding models down. It slows it becomes problematic in our academic wheelhouse of things that happen. But I think it's critical, and it's a conversation that we need to start pushing back on, is that we cannot do good research, we can't do good work until we have those relationships established and that trust built to do good work, right? It brings us away from that superficial, again, I'll kind of complain about AI forever on that one in its own right, but it's really important to break away from the superficial kind of surface level research and to start thinking about it at that relationship level. So I would say, yes, it is a challenge, but I think it's an important challenge and also a key piece to the core values of that CBPR work in terms of building those relationships. Thank you. Yeah.
Sitting next door, sorry, good. Great to hear a fellow Canadian and Albertan.
Yeah,
yes,
elbows
amazing.
up.
We're slowly taking over. I'm really curious about when you talked about the partnerships, have you actually gone back to some of these organizations that you saw in the coding to see if it was the same types of organizations or what kind of organizations were able to do that? And what is that factor? Because I think that we have a lot of practitioners here, but they're all government. So I was saying, is it strictly like centralized government, or is it offshoot government programs, or is it tertiary programs, or where do you see that really good research coming from?
Yeah. Yes, great question. And it is really important to look at those components to understand how we can make this more systematically functional as well. A lot of, and I'm going to kind of, hopefully I don't get in trouble for calling people out on this, but a lot of the organizations were organizations like United Way, the food banks, family centers, those types of things where they have a really core funding model, that they're very embedded in the community already, and so that sustainability from that piece becomes important. I think that's another really important advocacy piece to the not-for-profit sector, in how important it is for them to have sustainable funding, because we can't do good work without that kind of support, right? But many of those relationships were built in organizations, not-for-profit organizations, that had more capacity and more probably funding to be involved at a research level. And I think, again, going back, if you're familiar with the Canadian system, the United Way does tend to be one of those areas where if you are doing research in nonprofit outside of academic, for the nonprofit sector, that tends to be a really leading body just due to the funding models. So that does become an interesting conversation, and it does pose another additional challenge in engaging community outside of those larger entities as well. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I just wanted to tell you something that I thought you might like to hear. Is in Victoria, which is the state of Australia, the Local Government Act requires deliberative engagement processes. And we've just finished one in the Shire that I work involved with. What is really interesting, though, is a lot of this is provided by external moderators who've, building, that's their career, that's their job, and they do them for people, for the Shires and so on. But what is interesting is that as you're speaking, I'm thinking, I don't think there's any authorship at all. So the input is taken, and I don't think they even get to read the report. They may in our instance, but I think in a lot of Shires, it's not a process of shared authorship for the final document, which is really disappointing now that I'm listening to you. So it's a really good starting point, but the finishing point is having that authorship, well and truly.
Yeah, and going back to that stewardship piece, right, in terms of how are we building sustainability for those organizations, for those people in community to actually utilize and carry that work forward. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your excellent talk. I'm curious to know, are there any subject matters that you feel community-based participatory methodologies are better for than others? Are there places that you would say, yes, definitely going to use it for this topic, definitely not going to use it for that topic?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it comes down to very much about the field and what you're doing. There are certainly topics where it doesn't make sense to be going in that direction. But I would argue, and fight me if you disagree, I'm okay with that, is I don't think as social marketers there's anything that we're doing as we look at behavior change that shouldn't include community. I think pretty generally, anything that's falling under that social marketing umbrella really does need to take that look at how we're involving community voices and what that actually entails. And I think that went beautifully to Kim's talk yesterday around what biases we bring as researchers, and then is that the right thing? There are so many things that can come up in those conversations with community that we would never have thought of without having that conversation with them. So again, I think, arguably, social marketing really should be using CBPR. I think that's should be best practice going forward. That would be I will die on that hill. But I do agree that it does not scale out to all fields for sure. Yeah.
One last question at the back.
So my question actually follows on from that one. We do a lot of research on quite sensitive topics, and one of the things that's really helpful is being able to have people be part of the research anonymously. How, I guess I'm interested in whether you've had any experience in reconciling that side of things with transparency and authorship, and is that a barrier to participation?
Yes, thank you for that question. That's an excellent one, and what I've been grappling with. I do immigration settlement. As you can imagine, that does come up with some challenges around some of the participants that we talk with and deal with. Lots of challenges around people who are fearful of talking. Obviously, when there's status or no status in Canada, that can pose not just concerns, but legitimate issues around being seen or being identified. So there are certainly, I think, a lot more parameters that we need to talk about as social marketers, as anyone in any field using CBPR rather, on how we manage that data. I, for my project, have certainly been, we've incorporated PAR throughout the whole research design. It's going to extend into that dissemination conversation, but being very mindful of that confidentiality at the data level. So again, you're going through that piece and thinking, okay, where do we need to bring anonymity into the data before it can get passed on to our community partners in that way? So I think there's still lots of work to do, but certainly that becomes a really important question around when and where, when there needs to be buffers within your research design to ensure that people are staying safe. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks, Janelle.
Thank you.
Just wonderful work. I'd now like to welcome our next presenters up, Monica and Carolyn, who are presenting Connect Your Way, Lived Experience at the Heart of a Mental Health Campaign. So over to you.
Thank you, Maria. Hi, everyone. So Monica and I are presenting this morning about a